our next presenters. So if you want to learn how to design secret keys, well, you're in the right place. So their presentation is going to be about the secret life of secrets. So if you have any questions, please ask them on a Slido. You see the QR code outside of the theater, or you can go to BSidesSF.org/Q&A, and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. Thank you, and give another round of applause for our speakers.
All right, well, okay. So every year, hundreds of thousands of people take the wrong medication. And some researcher out there looked at that problem and asked, how can we use package design to increase medication accuracy? So these researchers conducted a study, and participants were asked to look at some drug and its packaging and determine whether or not something had the same active ingredient. So here we see package designs for allergy medication. Note the changes in branding, active design, and dosage. So comparing A and B, how much more accurate do you think medication active ingredient identifying do you think package B is compared to package A with these changes? Please raise your hand if you think it's 10%. All right, 20%? Okay, and what about 50%? Cool, yeah. So with these changes, the confusion errors were reduced by 2/3. And to dive a little deeper, there are two groups being studied. There is a younger group and an older group. The younger group started at 41%, and that dropped to 8% with these changes. The older group started at 68%, and it dropped to 16%. So with some really simple design changes, researchers were able to get some pretty notable improvements to decreasing human error. And while we're talking about medication and whatnot, let's talk about how we can use design to better patient outcomes. I was talking to my sister, and she is a psychiatry resident. She said that medication adherence is really a huge issue for all patients, but especially psychiatric patients. They might think that, oh, I feel good, so I don't really need to take this anyway. Or their brain tells them that it's a giant conspiracy. But she was saying that the big thing in hospitals now is you treat patients that are on antipsychotics. You used to treat them with like daily oral pills, and now it's moving to long-acting injectables. And the care is designed to be a monthly thing rather than a daily thing. So it's so much more convenient, and it's way easier to remember. And having them come in for the appointment, it's really good to like keep tabs on them. The patients can ask any of those off-the-cuff things that they might not remember if they meet less often. And it has led to much better health outcomes. There is an article in Nature on the real-world effectiveness of long-acting injectables for patients with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And like the mean number and duration of psychiatric hospitalizations really declined with this change in their patient care and design.
One more anecdote on how user experience and design can have a dramatic impact on the real world. A few years ago, I met the founder of Code for America. Is anybody familiar with Code for America? A few hands going up. They're a nonprofit that do civic-related things. And she basically made this argument to me and the room full of people at the time that if you take all of charity within the United States, you add every single dollar up going to every charity across all of the United States, that's the number you get. It's a little bit less than $5 billion for all of charity. If you compare that to the US welfare system, it's not even close. Like, by far, if you're trying to get money to people in need, there's way more money in the US welfare system to do that than every charity added up combined. So her pitch to the room was basically, if we can get one designer, one person to make the US welfare system a little bit easier to sign up, because most people that are eligible for welfare don't take advantage of it. It's hard to get through all the paperwork and the user experience isn't great. If we could just make it 10% easier, that one individual designer can give back more to people in need than all of charity combined. Okay, so the talk is about API keys. What are we doing talking about all these other things? I think the bottom line is user experience and UX can have a dramatic influence on whatever it is we're talking about. If we're talking about API keys, though, it means the way you design your API keys can fundamentally lead them leaking out less or leaking out more, or other security implications which we'll get into based on how you design those keys. So my name's Dylan. Is there audio? They asked if we wanted to use audio in our talk, and we'd never done that before. We thought it would be fun, so we tried to mix in a little bit. But my name's Dylan. I'm the security researcher. I started a company called Truffle Security based on a popular open source tool that I authored a few years ago. I've spoken at a bunch of large conferences like DEF CON and Black Hat.
Hi, I'm Han. I work in the intersection of software security and UX, and I've previously spoke at conferences like BSidesSF and Black Hat Arsenal.
Cool. So yeah, at a 10,000 foot view, we're not going to go into what Truffle Security, the company we work at, does, but we spend a lot of time doing open source work on secrets in particular. We're built on top of the open source tool TruffleHog, which finds secrets leaked out. So that's just to say we've put a lot of thought and care into this particular space, and that's why we wanted to talk about it. So let's say you're designing a brand new API. First thing one might do is Google how to design a brand new API. You'll get a whole bunch of documentation explaining how. The #1 search result is from Postman, and it's got a whole bunch of different considerations for the nouns to use and how JSON should respond, status codes. The word security does not show up on the entire page. You know, like that's kind of interesting. For some of the ones where security does show up, it's mostly talking about what you can do within the API, role-based access controls, IDOR, those types of things. Nowhere could we find a comprehensive guide talking about how to design the keys for your API, right? It's such a critical piece of security. Security is usually left out. You know, we thought just because we spend all day looking at keys, we could spend a little bit of time just specifically talking about the way keys are designed and how it can have security outcomes. So what about the keys is the long story short. We're not talking about what the keys can do. So it's not talking about what kind of access you'll get with the keys, but specifically we're talking about the user experience of the keys themselves, the way they're shaped and textured, and how that can have an influence on security.
All right, so why does this matter? Is that it? Are we just talking about shapes and textures today? Yes, that is it. So why does this matter? Design influences behavior. And I think it's worth examining any behavior, no matter how big or small, if it leads to better and more secure outcomes. If you're interested in hearing more about UX practices and security, I'm speaking tomorrow again at 11. All right, so the form factor of keys. So what if we put a square peg in the round hole? The wrong shape and texture for secrets. Well, if you've worked at a large tech company before and you haven't really seen how decisions get made without security around, we're gonna pull back the curtain on that a little bit and shed some light on how certain decisions might have happened based on our experiences at these companies. So we are doing a fictitious reenactment of a design choice that resulted in tons of secrets leaking out. So sometime long, long ago in an office far, far away, we're in the office of Cat Chat, somewhere where all the cool kitty cats gather.
Hey everybody, I am a product manager here at Cat Chat. Cat Chat is the company that is designed to make cats collaborate easier with one another. We're gonna change the world one cat at a time. And basically, we've got this new idea for a feature that we believe can dramatically improve our API adoption. Long story short, cats don't like our API, but they do like URLs. We did some intense user research and we found that cats really like to engage with URLs. They click on them, they share them, and not a lot of cats are using our API. API keys are scary. So we thought, what if we could combine these two things and get more API adoption if we have URLs to transact with those APIs? Introducing the Cat Chat webhook.
Hey Kat, this is Dog from security team. This is my first time hearing all this, and I have a lot of concerns and a lot of questions. But like, just to start, you said this interacts with APIs. What exactly does this do with APIs?
Yeah, no, I love that question. Love the security team. Great to have you here, dog. So, look, long story short, with one of these cat chat webhook URLs, cats will be able to take one of these webhook URLs and send arbitrary messages to a channel with whatever username they want, whatever message body they want, whatever profile picture they want, and they'll be able to upload arbitrary file attachments to that message.
Cat, this sounds like an API key. I really don't think secrets should go in URLs. It's basically a whole new paradigm for interaction. URLs are often logged, they're cached, they're shared, and people already are used to interacting with URLs in a really specific way. And there's even a whole CWE around sensitive query strings in URLs. So when people see an API key, they know how to handle it. They don't share it, they don't take pictures of it, and they don't log it everywhere. But URLs, I'm not so sure.
Gosh, can I just take a moment to say how important security is to us here at Cat Chat? I hear you there. Tell you what I heard the most there is that it's an issue to have sensitive data end up in the logs. So why don't we spend a little bit of extra time making sure that none of these sensitive Cat Chat webhooks end up in any of our logs? Does that sound like it'll solve the problem?
No, that's just one of the concerns. What about our users? These look like URLs. And what if they handle them insecurely?
Okay, that's fair. Well, tell you what if in our official documentation, we say, don't handle these insecurely?
Oh my God, dude, no one reads our docs. What if other companies copy this design as well? Our logs are fine, but like, what about their logs?
Yeah, I mean, look, so I remember earlier when I said that Cat Chat is changing the world and everything, but we're a relatively small company, all things considered. I really don't think we have to worry about a whole bunch of large companies like copying our API key design patterns here.
I don't know. This is bad for the security industry. Like, people are used to interacting with tech in a very particular way. Why are we changing that?
All right, don't worry. I've dealt with security a whole bunch of times. I've got a plan for this. Tell you what, dog, I love the collaboration here. Why don't we take a lot of these concerns that you have and put them in a document, and we'll address them offline. How's that sound?
That's it. All right. So, do you think this feature was revisited? Well, Cat Chat never tackled those concerns, and the features were shipped exactly as described. For the PM, they're right. People love URLs, and Cat Chat took off. But for that security professional, their worst nightmare came true. What Cat Chat did with keys and URLs became somewhat of a design pattern, and companies like Slack, Microsoft Teams, Discord, they all use that pattern now.
By the way, it's just a fun fact, that feature is called a webhook now. Those companies all call them webhooks. So I thought it would be fun to actually reach out to the person who originally invented the term webhook. His name's Jeff. He's just a guy, it turns out. And I asked Jeff, I was like, hey, do you think this fits the definition of the way you intended the word webhook to mean? And he was like, no, these aren't webhooks. Like, they're basically just API keys. I don't know why they called them webhooks. They don't fit the traditional definition of the word. But as a consequence of the way these keys are shaped, the way they're shaped like URLs, we recently went and scraped a whole bunch of websites looking for API keys. There's the breakdown. If you ignore cloud from this graph, the number one common, most leaked out SaaS key are these webhook URLs. And that makes sense. They look like URLs. They don't look like API keys, and it just tends to them leaking out way, way, way more often than every other type of API key out there. So API keys, or webhook URLs, were first introduced in around 2015. Jeff, the guy that invented the term webhook, he also floated the idea that maybe these more closely fit the definition of capability URLs. Capability URLs are basically a URL that can do stateful things. Usually not a good practice, by the way, because of something called CSRF. But there are some use cases where it's unavoidable, like password reset URLs. The thing is, capability URLs are all initiated by a user, and these webhook URLs are initiated by services and are used to transact with an API. So we didn't think capability URLs really fit the definition either. These are effectively just API keys. They're API keys that look like URLs, and that's kind of what led to them leaking out more than any other key out there, is our general hypothesis around those.
Yeah, so cat chat sure did a lot of damage. But stepping back for a second, have you ever heard of the rule, change your passwords once a month? Well, that rule hails back to the day of non-networked mainframes and all the concerns about cracking them and getting access. There was some napkin math happening back then, and it was like, how long would it take to run all possible passwords to get into the mainframe? It was roughly several months. So changing your password once a month was meant to prevent that brute forcing cracking attempt. And that became policy. And that was the best practice for that situation, a non-networked mainframe in a Department of Defense environment. But tech doesn't really work like that anymore. And that design pattern was passed down for a really long time without necessarily examining why. Now the advice on changing passwords once a month is dying out, and that's actually kind of great. So before recklessly copying patterns you see in the wild, it's really important to examine how and why it is a pattern in the first place, and if it even makes sense to implement as well. We've been talking about an interaction pattern that accidentally became the norm. Well, what if we have the inverse? A bunch of companies coming together to create a standard pattern of interaction. So you're creating a large distributed system. You want things fast. You have multiple services talking to each other, and you want to minimize transaction time between them. Well, we have JOTS here. Yay, JOTS. JOTS solve all that. It's centralized creation, it decentralizes checking, and it provides minimal database transactions. They use cryptography to solve all those problems for large distributed systems focused on scale. Sounds great, right? We love cryptography, having crypto solve all our problems. So what is a JOT? To kind of break down the structure and the shape and the texture, we have a header, a payload, and a signature. The header is the specification for the signature, the payload is a set of claims, and the signature validates the entire thing.
Are most people familiar with JOTs, by the way, by show of hands? Most hands going up. A common misconception about JOTs, they are not base64 encoded. They're a special encoding called URL safe base64 encoding, which just begs the question, like when it comes to design and UX, why did they go out of their way to make them URL safe? Like, we don't want these things in server logs. We don't want them leaking all out over the place. But they were designed to be URL safe. It just kind of comes back to base principles of UX. If you make them URL safe, it's going to lead to them ending up in URLs.
All right, so also let's take a closer look at the structure. So in the first block, you see there's algorithm specification. And depending on the selected algorithm, it's either, the JOT is either symmetric or asymmetric, so either a signature or a cryptographic HMAC. Kind of interesting, we see none there. That's a really interesting decision. And even more interesting is, where's the expiration? Well, you probably know that you can't really revoke a JOT easily.
Yeah, sorry. So the expiration is an optional field, so you can include it in the header. If you don't have an expiration, they can't be revoked. If you do have an expiration, then you just have to wait for it to expire. The alternative is you have a database you check, but the whole point of the JWT was to cut the database out. So that's why usually they just don't expire, or they can't be revoked, or you have to wait for them to expire if there is an expiration.
So yeah, let's focus on the weak symmetric keys. If you use a weak symmetric key,
yeah, are people familiar with this research here for cracking JWTs with weak symmetric keys? Not many hands going up. So basically, long story short, is a symmetric key in the context of a JWT is often just a password. It doesn't have to be. Like, you can generate a long, secure string, but developers will often just use a password. And the thing about passwords is we have very rich libraries and dictionaries of passwords. And so if you have a JWT that generates a signature, and you test every single password against that JWT to see if it matches the signature, when you use passwords to sign JWTs, that leads to people being able to guess the passwords. And you can do all that cracking offline because you have the JWT. So there's some research there if you want to look into it of what that looks like to crack it. If you guess the password correctly, you can then manufacture as many JWTs as you want with any claims that you want. You can pretend to be any user. You can set whatever expiration date you want. It's bad, right? So we decided to take a look and see how common that actually is. So we went to Showdown, and for all the symmetric key JWTs that are returned to you as soon as you hit the website, we downloaded every single one of those. It was a few thousand we downloaded off Showdown. And we tried to load them all up into Hashcat and see how many of them we could guess that password for. So the long story short is a lot. Like, we were able to guess the password for over 2% of them, and it wasn't the most sophisticated password cracking setup out there, which is wild, because these are production keys. These are the ones on the internet already. These aren't pre-production, but these are sitting on the edge. 2% of them, we could guess that symmetric key, and then we could use that symmetric key to then manufacture as many JWTs as we want with whatever claims we want. And so I think this is the tricky part. When we're recommending something like a common spec or a protocol, if we know the 2% of developers that implement it are going to do the wrong thing, are going to pick a weak symmetric key that we can crack, doesn't make sense to recommend it. That's a huge number.
all right, and that's not the only issue. So we hinted at it earlier, but in the algorithm options, the word none is there. And that's built into the spec. And it allows for the creation of a JWT without cryptography. And all the libraries initially supported it because it was literally in the spec. So in the libraries, like if a developer does not specify an algorithm type, the libraries are just kind of let it through because it'd be none, and that's valid. So libraries treated none algorithms as like a valid token with like a verified signature because the developer does not specify. And that seems like a bit of a UX oversight because it's like, what's the safe default here? And we allow the default to then be unsafe. There's a lot of interesting bypasses around JWTs now about how to use none to kind of take over the JWT. Yeah, take over the JWT. And there's a lot of best practices. A lot of them are around none.
Look, the long story short, here are two one-off examples of issues that you have when you introduce the cryptography of JWTs, but the list is a lot longer. Like, we don't have time to go through them all. We just picked two of the fun ones. There's a long list of considerations that you now have to worry about with JWTs, all of which are cryptographic in nature. If you're curious about the full list, the latest spec for JWTs actually lists them all. They're up on the screen here. But this makes sense. Like, when you introduce cryptography, you have cryptographic issues that are a consequence of that. And this is just a lot to put on a developer, to have them understand how all these different cryptographic issues can play into the way they're implementing JWTs. And we know from experience from surveying the internet that some non-negligible percentage of developers are going to mess these things up if you recommend the standard as a whole. So I think that kind of goes back to some of the base principles here. When it comes to symmetric keys in JWTs, if you recommend symmetric keys, 2% of people are going to mess them up. So does it make sense to recommend them? I think that's the question. Does it make sense to have sort of this opportunity to mess up when you maybe could just take that away? Like if you're only recommending asymmetric keys, there's no opportunity to mess up the symmetric key component as an example of that. As another fun fact, I reached out to one of the original 10 people who were cited in the first JWT spec as an author of JWTs. This is the father of JWTs, I guess. And I asked him a bunch of questions. One of the questions was just, hey, like, how do you think about this? Like, if you teach developers to do this thing and some percentage of them do the wrong thing, is the answer evangelism, education? Like, how do you fix this? And he was basically, well, it's a fool's errand to trust them. Like, no matter what you teach them, like, it's a fool's errand to have to count on them alone. You need additional security checks and controls in place. And that's just a lot to have to worry about if you're recommending the spec and you know the developers are going to mess them up, and the author of the JWTs is saying the developers are going to mess them up. Now you need this whole tail end of checking and controls to account for that.
All right, so when using JOTs, just really step back and decide, is this the right tool for your toolbox? Is this another change your password every 1 month kind of situation? Do you have a distributed systems problem that needs cryptography? What exactly are the benefits given that revocation's hard, there's crypto problems, etc.? It's really great if the goal, so basically just like go with the simple flow. Don't introduce other errors by going with like what's necessarily popular and what everyone else is doing. Just like think and keep things simple.
And that's not to say there's anything wrong with JWTs. It's one tool in the toolbox that should be used for particular problems. So if you have a distributed systems problem, if you're avoiding database transactions, great, makes sense. If you're going to hit the database every time anyway, or if you have a low enough volume of user transactions where it doesn't matter, maybe it's not the right tool for the job, and maybe the risks it brings in aren't worth the benefits. The next one that I'm going to touch on, I think we're running short on time, so I'll probably have to skip at least one pattern here. But this is a design pattern where you bring your own API key to the table. The one that probably pops to mind for most people is GitHub, where you can upload your own private key to GitHub and use that to transact with GitHub's API. They do that through SSH private keys. You can use it to both read and write code to GitHub by uploading your SSH key to the platform. Another maybe lesser known example is Oracle Cloud. Same deal, you can upload a key to Oracle Cloud and use that to transact with the API. Technically, Google allows you to do this too, but it's not the default. The default is they will make a key for you, but you can override that. With Oracle, you're always uploading your own. With GitHub, you're always uploading your own. Well, the problem is, if you're uploading your own, then you have opportunities to mess up your own key generation. So I tried to upload an insecure key to GitHub, and what happens, I uploaded a key so small, I knew I could factor it, so 512-bit key. And GitHub rejects it. It's like, we recommend at least 2048 bits, which isn't factorable today. The largest key that I could see factored to date was 1039. I'm not a cryptographer, by the way. If people know that I'm wrong about some of these numbers, feel free to come see me after. This is from the Wikipedia page for factoring these keys. A 1039-bit integer was factored. So I said, okay, what if we split the difference? Like, they said upload 2048, and they won't let me do 512. What if I upload something in the middle there with 1024? I literally had ChatGPT make the key for me, and then I uploaded it to GitHub. Does anyone want to guess what happened? Like, on the last slide, it said, make sure it's 2048. The long story short is it let me upload it. So that's weird, right? Like, that they know that you're not supposed to do it, but they let you do it anyway. And then that, of course, led to the next question of how often are people uploading keys that are small enough, in theory, they could be factored? So just for context, we downloaded every single SSH public key off of the platform from every single user, and we analyzed them all. Over 11,000 of them are small enough they can be factored. And then we looked at what repos they were pushing to, and they're pushing to some pretty big named repos. Like, I'm not gonna name them here, but like, just trust us. Like, if you could take over those keys, you'd be able to push code to some pretty sensitive repos out there. So, it's just something to think about, that when it comes to allowing users to pick their own keys, if you give them the autonomy to do something insecure, some percentage of them are going to do something insecure. That's a log-based graph, before anybody chews me out for that. It's a little bit just biased in that way, but just as a heads up there. And then the other thing we looked at, which is another fun thing, is for all the SSH keys we downloaded, how many of them are reused between accounts, which you never want to have happen, right? You want to generate your own keys, you want them to be unique per key. How many of those keys were reused between accounts? A lot. We're running short on time, but long story short, if you let users do insecure things, they're going to do insecure things. And here's some fun examples of that, where we just found students ripping random private keys from random places and using it as their SSH key, thinking that it would be a secure thing. But it's not. And it's easy to check too. You could just take these private keys and test them against GitHub, see if you can SSH in. If you give users the autonomy to do something bad, some percentage of them are going to do something bad.
Yeah, so leaving all the bells and whistles to your users, sure. But bring your own key pushes the security completely on your end user. And there are novice and pro people in the field. So yay to control and all, but what about the guardrails? What are the consequences of not having them? And what do we gain exactly by letting users control all this?
We're running super short on time, so we're just going to cut right through MTLS as a design pattern. But the long story short is, with MTLS, you have, long story short, if you use MTLS, you have the revocation issue that we talked about previously, you have the reuse issue, and you have cryptographic configuration options issues. So if you introduce cryptography into your system, you're going to have cryptography problems. And if you give users the ability to have insecure keys, if they have that user experience, some of them are going to take that flow. We want to kind of end things with a quote from a famous person. We thought this was a really good quote. Make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. Albert Einstein authored this quote, or so we thought. Actually, what happened was we took our talk and we fed it into ChatGPT. We asked it for a quote that best fit our talk, and it gave us a bunch of examples. And as it turns out, Einstein did not write this quote. We thought it was a good quote, though.
Alrighty, so we complained a lot, and that's not the most productive, so we're going to go through some recommendations super fast. So 1, generate the secure keys for your users. Don't let them do it. 2, be really careful on when you introduce cryptography. It solves a lot of problems, but it can also cause them. 3, make it easy to discover leak keys. If you're looking at your log and you see a bunch of random strings, do you think that's a key initially? Well, GitHub had a token that was the same shape and length and texture as a SHA-1 hash. And a ton of keys were leaking out, and it was really hard for GitHub to find it and in their secret scanner. It's kind of like security by obscurity, so let's not do that. So GitHub has since prefixed their keys, so prefixing keys, great idea.
Okay, so where does this leave us most of the time? First of all, if users have a certain expectation of what keys look like and how to handle those keys, if you follow that expectation, that can lead to good outcomes. What Han just mentioned, there's a ton of companies doing that pattern. So basically, a secure enough length that you're generating for your user with a fixed prefix that helps you find those keys. That's how AWS does it. That's how GitHub does it. That's how Tailscale does it. That's how Twilio does it. That's how Stripe does it. That's how a ton of different providers do it. Don't go reinventing the wheel if there is a good pattern that's influencing good behavior today. And also come back to the base questions of why providers are doing this. Why are they sticking a prefix in front? Why are they going with URL design? And sort of question some of those things and how it might influence the behaviors of your users. Okay, so what does it mean secure length and how to generate it? I don't know. 20 characters is a gajillion combinations. It's probably good enough, right? Long story short is if you generate 20 random secure characters and you have that prefix in the front and you're generating the keys for your user, it will tend to those keys leaking out less than if your keys look like URLs. And if you're generating them for your users, you don't have the opportunity for your users to mess up the key generation themselves. And also, it doesn't have many risks of cryptography issues that come from the introduction of J2Ts, which sometimes you may have to use because of distributed systems, but if you can avoid it, there are some benefits from avoiding it. So why make it any more complicated than that?
Thank you all so much for coming. We'll be around if you have any questions.